Regional seat in Scotland. Andrew Cassell reports.
You don't have to look far in Ayr to seek out the anti-Labour mood music, especially if you turn to the pensioners. This day centre in the heart of the town is earmarked for closure as the Labour-run council looks for cuts to balance the books. Those who use it are not impressed.
I, for one, would just love somebody from the Labour to come up and say, "Can I have your vote?" And I'm sorry, I would forget that I was a lady and say some very, very rude words.
The people of Ayr, if they've got any sense, the elderly people, will be voting for any of the other parties except Labour.
Why did you force through this repeal?
On top of that, opponents of the devolved executive's decision to scrap Clause 28, banning the promotion of homosexuality in schools, have dogged Labour's efforts to counter the perception that its record in running Scotland since devolution has somehow failed to live up to expectations.
We've got a lot of good things for this electorate, and of course mid-term by-elections are difficult. I have to say to you that if you look back over the last 10-15 years, you will see just how difficult they can be.
The problem for Labour in Scotland is that disenchanted supporters have an alternative, and that alternative could relegate them into third place in this contest.
The Scottish National Party is the only party that can stop the Tories.
The nationalist bandwagon has been out in force in Ayr. It's not natural SNP territory, but the party's been pointing up what it says are Labour's difficulties in power, and its leader has been a frequent visitor to the town.
The last thing that folk in Ayr want is to be sent back to sleep with the old Tories or a continuation of old Tory policies from New Labour. They want an alternative, not a substitute, and we're providing that exciting, positive change.
Political observers with a close eye on the polls and last May's election results discern a pattern emerging in this tussle between Labour and the SNP.
People seem less inclined to vote for Labour in a Scottish election than for a Westminster one. It looks as though they're less willing to trust Labour as the best party to look after Scotland's interests in Holyrood as compared with running the UK government at Westminster.
But it's the Conservatives who are the front runners in this marginal seaside town. The seat used to be a safe Tory one until Labour's general election landslide and the May devolution poll. Now, however, the party which used to oppose the Scottish Parliament senses voters may be returning. William Hague says the Tories have learnt from past mistakes.
It's changed a lot in the last 2 years, and now we have Scottish candidates, policies decided in Scotland for the Scottish Parliament, a leader in the Scottish Parliament who's doing an extremely good job, and people can see that the Conservative Party has been sorting itself out.
The Liberal Democrats are hoping to win credit among younger voters for their role in diverting more money into education.
The strength within the executive, the people who have been competent, the people who have been delivering, have been the Liberal Democrats. That would seem to us to be an argument for strengthening the Liberal Democrats within that executive.
The Scottish Socialists, a possible alternative for disaffected Labour votes, could upset those plans, while the Greens are hoping to add to their solitary seat in the Scottish Parliament. For most here, the contest in Ayr will be a referendum on 8 months of devolved government in the new Scotland. Before long, the headlines in the newspapers will inform us of the verdict. Andrew Cassell, BBC News, Ayr.
And News 24 will have full live coverage of the declaration in the Ayr by-election in just a few minutes from midnight. Now let's take a look at what's been happening on the market.
Good evening, this is BBC News 24, where we're bringing you live coverage of the first by-election in the life of the new Scottish Parliament. It's a fascinating contest. Labour has the tiniest of majorities, just 25, which the Tories are confident of overturning. Well, if that happens, and there's even talk of Labour slipping into third place, it would be the first by-election defeat for this government since they came to power. Well, the count is well underway. We'll be finding out, hopefully, in the next hour, what the voters of this West Coast constituency of Ayr have actually decided. It is a constituency famous both for its golf courses at Troon and the home of Robert Burns. Tourism, engineering and fishing are the main industries, and politically, it's been one of the few Tory strongholds in Scotland until it was snatched by Labour. Tonight, though, the signs for Labour don't look good. Disaffection among the traditional supporters, unhappiness with the First Minister Donald Dewar, Section 28, a whiff of sleaze, and the spiralling cost of the new Parliament building have all heaped up problems for the government. Well, that's the background. Let's go straight to the count, and our correspondent there, Andrew Cassell. Andrew, when are we expecting this result?
Well, we're still, if everything goes to plan, we're still on course, we think, for a declaration, well, round about just over an hour's time, we think. But, of course, the news from here is that the Tories have that rare thing, a smile on their face in Scotland. You'll know that they found the going pretty tough in Scotland over the last few years, but it looks as though they're on course to take this seat, and to do so probably, we think, with a majority round about 2,000 is what they're saying. So they're pretty happy about that, and to give you some idea of the scale of that achievement is the last gain by the Scottish Tories in Scotland, the last gain at a by-election. You have to go way back to 1967, and a young lady called Sandy Shaw was winning the European Song Contest with a puppet on a string, I think the song was. So that gives you a scale of a sense of the scale of the achievement if the Tories have indeed taken this seat. But also interesting, it looks as though Labour may have been pushed into third place by the SNP. They're looking pretty cock-a-hoop too.
Well, we're all talking about predictions at the moment. Have the parties started to spin their various interpretations of this result?
Yes, they have. I think Labour are looking pretty glum. They're saying, well, you know, it's a marginal, it's the most marginal seat in the UK, majority of 25. They point to Clause 28, this campaign being run by Brian Souter, the Stagecoach millionaire, against proposals to scrap Clause 28. They say that's been a constant backdrop to their campaign. It's stopped them getting a positive message across. So that's the kind of spin they're putting on it. They're also saying, you know, that they didn't expect to win this seat or retain it, and it was a pretty sensational result to get it from the Tories in the Scottish elections last year. So that's the kind of spin they're putting on it. The SNP, of course, have a completely different version of events. They're gearing up to put forward this as a marvellous achievement by the Nationalists in an area which isn't natural SNP territory, that is for certain, but they have been here in force during their campaign. Alex Salmond, their leader, has been here, it seems, every day. So they put a lot of effort into this, and they're saying they've kicked Labour into third place, and they'll have a sensational showing. So that's pretty much how it's panning out. It looks as though the Liberal Democrats may lose their deposit again. OK, Andrew Cassell, we'll be back to you a little later for that result. For now, thanks very much indeed. Well, joining me here to discuss some of those points and to analyse all of tonight's events are our Chief Political Correspondent Nick Robinson and the Professor of Politics at Oxford University, Ian McLean. Good evening to you both. It's going to be a fascinating night. Nick, first, how much of a blow, how humiliating if they are pushed into the third for Labour?
Context is all in this case. You could easily have seen a result like this as just simply midterm blues. You might say Labour only a majority of 25 when this seat was run in the Scottish Parliament elections. So what that Labour lose it? It was a Tory seat for many, many years. So what? But context is all. The context at the moment is twofold. On the one hand, the government at the UK level, on the back foot for the first time in a long time, criticised for abandoning its heartland voters. On the other hand, the Scottish administration, the Scottish Labour Party, also on the back foot, criticised for the way it's running it, and with the SNP running it neck and neck in the polls for the Scottish Parliament. In that context, it's very serious indeed. Both in a Scottish context, it's a worry about the next set of Scottish parliamentary elections and whether the SNP could take control of Holyrood when it eventually becomes Holyrood. On the other hand, also some people will use this within the Labour Party to say, I told you so, in our heartlands, people don't like what we're doing.
Professor McLean, 10 months only since Labour won this seat, only by 25 admittedly, but what has happened, do you think, in the meantime for this change?
Well, not a lot need have happened. I agree with what Nick just said, that in normal times we might be saying for the governing party to do as badly as this in a midterm by-election is actually for the governing party to do quite well. Governing parties always do badly in by-elections. Labour has been unfortunate in a number of incidents, probably unconnected with each other, which have dented its image as the governing party or the governing coalition in Scotland. And there are, if I can put it this way, structural factors which always make it bad for Labour when Labour is in government in Scotland. People who are disaffected with Labour have the SNP to turn to. They have nothing equivalent to that in England.
Well, let us take a look at the exact facts and figures of the change in the last 10 months. Let's go back 10 months and see the result of the 1999 Scottish Parliament election. There it is, there are the numbers, and there you see the percentages in those block columns. And we're about to see that graphic actually change into what we expect to happen tonight. The by-election opinion poll taken from earlier in the week. Well, dramatic difference there.
Yes, certainly. The Conservatives ahead by, on those figures, somewhat more than the word from the counties is coming tonight. SNP coming second in that poll, and I would be pretty surprised if they don't come second in the actual poll that we're going to hear about.
Nick Robertson, William Hague has been talking about this result, hopefully for the Tories, transforming their position in Scotland. Can we see that from those figures if they pan out to be much as that opinion poll suggests?
Well, again, yes and no. In share of the vote, no, you can't see a big transformation. That poll, I suspect, is rather generous to them, as Ian was suggesting, in terms of the actual result we're likely to get tonight. But yes, it will transform them for this reason. They haven't won a first-past-the-vote election since the Scottish Parliament was set up. They only got seats on this top-up system, which Tony Blair's always telling us how generous he was, introducing proportional representation to help the parties out, who wouldn't have won seats on first-past-the-post. And it gets them back on track in Scotland. It allows them to say, we're a force in Scotland once again. They haven't won a by-election in Scotland for more than 30 years. They haven't won a by-election, after all, UK-wide for 16.
So psychologically important. Let's extrapolate it, if we can, to the national level, the general election. Let's go back to 1997 for the result then, and there you see that landslide Labour victory in 97, almost 50% of the vote. Well, we're going to go to an opinion poll showing what would happen if the Ayr electorate voted tomorrow in a general election, and there you actually see it. And just talk us through that, Nick, your interpretation of that.
Well, what's fascinating is the difference between that and the Scottish parliamentary election. This is the same poll, people asked at the same time. These are not different polls, but they're asked, how will you vote if it was a Scottish Parliament election, as tonight's by-election is? How, on the other hand, would you vote if it was a general election? And what that's showing us is how low that yellow bar is when it's a general election. In other words, people are voting for the SNP where they are, and they are saying that in a poll where they are, precisely because it's a Scottish parliamentary situation. It's a Scottish statement. The SNP are the opposition in Scotland. That's what they're saying. When it's a Westminster election, the figures change. It becomes much more a traditional Tory seat, although Labour did very well, of course, in the general election.
Professor, is it a protest vote for Labour in terms of going over to the SNP, or are they successfully making progress on that independence line that they push?
There's at least two things going on. One is that the SNP is always a receptacle for Labour protest votes. The other, as Nick has just said, is that quite clearly, as we just saw, the intended vote for SNP for a Scottish Parliament election is higher than for a Westminster one. And that is a pattern you see all over. You see it in Quebec, you see it in Spain. The separatist parties do better in local elections than in federal level elections. Doesn't mean to say that there's a majority in Ayr for independence. Not yet, at any rate.
OK, Professor, Nick, we'll be back to you both a little later. Let's, though, now go back to the count in Ayr and our correspondent there, Andrew Cassell.
Matthew, welcome back to Ayr. Things progressing. As we heard earlier, we think the Tories are on to a victory here with SNP in second place and Labour third. And joining me here in the Count Hall is Dean Nelson, political editor of The Scotsman. Dean, an extraordinary situation if Labour come third to the SNP. That would be really bad news for the government here, won't it?
Well, it's the first. It would be bad news. This is the first major test of the popularity of the Labour government in Scotland since devolution, and there's been a lot of general dissatisfaction. The government in Scotland has faced one sort of PR disaster after another. There's been sleaze, there's been Lobbygate. There have been a number of resignations and sackings of special advisors. The government here is not seen to be doing anything in the way that Blair's government is in London, and there's a very sharp difference in the perception of the Labour government in Westminster, which is still very popular in Scotland, and the Labour government in Holyrood in Edinburgh, which is suffering, as we can see from these figures that are indicated, quite badly.
But what has been the problem for Labour? Because they point to all these things they've done in devolved government, and then they have Clause 28, which throughout the campaign seems to have dogged them persistently.
And Clause 28 has been a problem in that you had a very wealthy tycoon able to pay for a huge amount of posters. It's like being up against yet another political party, and it's a lot of criticism for the government. So, but it doesn't indicate any broader pattern, I don't think. There's some general dissatisfaction with the government in Scotland. Section 28, people are very polarised in their views on it, but there's no indication that there's people's views on Section 28 that's driving the voting intentions in this election.
But what's its importance then? that it stopped Labour getting its message across, as it were?
I think it's just had Labour on the back foot. It's yet another thing that they're having to be defensive about, rather than, you know, enabling them to actually focus on those things that are positive for them. It's yet more criticism, more defensiveness on Labour's part, and yet another sort of issue that has stopped them going forward.
But how are Labour going to get out of this? I mean, to lose the seats to the Conservatives, they can explain away, 25-seat majority, but to lose to their arch rivals, the Nationalists?
Absolutely. I mean, there seems to be an inversion. At the last Scottish election, the SNP were down in the sort of 19% area. Labour was up 38%, just slightly above the Tories. That seems to be the complete inverse of that at the moment.
And briefly, what about the Tories? A pretty good result for them, isn't it?
It is a good result, but it depends exactly where they get. If they get 38% of this election, they'll be exactly where they were at the Scottish election. They need to go beyond that for William Hague to be able to latch onto it as early evidence of a UK recovery.
But it's so maybe not a recovery, but certainly a good achievement if they get it.
I mean, they'll be hailing everything they can get. A victory will be a victory, but the level at which William Hague weighs in and claims it as a UK victory, something that actually leads the way to a Tory comeback, depends on how far above 38% they get.
Dean Nelson, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. So there we have it. Perhaps not a Tory revival, but it does look as though we're on to a Tory victory here anyway. Matthew.
Andrew, thanks very much indeed. But we'll have more on the Ayr by-election as it happens here on BBC News 24. Now, though, it's Joanna Gosling with tonight's other headlines.
Thanks, Matthew. It's 1:45.
Good evening, this is BBC News 24, where we're bringing you live coverage of the first by-election in the life of the new Scottish Parliament, where we're expecting a result in Ayr very soon, and the signs are that the Conservative Party will be celebrating tonight. A majority of around 2,000 is predicted for its candidate, John Scott. Good news too is predicted for the Scottish National Party, which is expected to take second place. Labour, by contrast, which won the seat 10 months ago with a majority of 25, seems destined to end up in third place. Well, let's go straight to the couch, and our correspondent there, Andrew Cassell. Andrew, victory for the Conservative Party, psychologically important for them in Scotland.
Yes, I think it is. They've had a pretty rough time of it in recent years. Their opposition to devolution didn't do them very much favours in the devolution poll in May. So if they win this will be the first by-election gain for the Conservatives since, would you believe it, 1967. Sandy Shaw was winning the European Song Contest with that Puppet on a String song. So they're quoting that all over the place because I think they're rather pleased. So we've seen a rather rare sight here in Ayr tonight, and that is satisfaction and even some smiles amongst Scottish Tories. Also smiles, of course, amongst the SNP. And you've joined us just a few moments ago. The returning officer called the candidates forward, so we can't be that far away from a declaration. I would suggest maybe about 5, possibly 10 minutes.
What sort of campaign has it been? Because William Hague has been there twice, Tony Blair not at all.
Yes, and that was the contrast really that many of Labour's opponents were pointing up. William Hague senses, I think, that some voters are beginning to return to the Tory party. Been a huge reorganisation, of course, in the Scottish Conservative Party. They now have their own leader in the Scottish Parliament, thanks to the proportional representation voting system for the parliamentary elections in Scotland. They actually have a good body of MSPs, so they've been able to perform in the Parliament. They've reorganised, they have more say at a local level, at a Scottish level, more freedom, if you like, from Mr Hague, so they can make their own decisions. So he says that's helped them. So he's been up giving them lending them a supporting hand and making that clear. So, but of course, when Mr Blair came up to Scotland, he studiously avoided Ayr. I think they've known for a while that the Labour vote was soft. It was just a question of how soft it would be, and it looks tonight as if they've probably lost quite a considerable amount of ground to the SNP.
OK, we'll be back to you in a few minutes. Andrew Cassell, thanks very much indeed. Well, speaking on BBC Scotland earlier this evening, Henry McLean, a Labour minister in the Scottish Parliament, admitted it looked like being a bad night for Labour.
Well, I don't think it's going to be a good morning or a good evening for Labour, Ian. I think that's obviously clear. Obviously, I don't want to say too much until we get the actual result. But this has been tough territory for Labour. It is the most marginal seat in the country. There's been an exceptional set of factors at work here. But on the other hand, it's going to be a bad election result. Obviously, we're disappointed, and I think I feel for the candidate, because I think by all accounts Rita Miller has been an excellent candidate. She'll be bitterly disappointed if the result turns out as projected, and overall we've got to certainly learn lessons of what has happened, but overall a bad night for Labour.
Your effect? Well, still here with me as the declaration approaches, and we're only a couple of minutes away, is our chief political correspondent Nick Robinson and the Professor of Politics at Oxford University, Ian McLean. Nick, a bad night, Henry McLean saying. That's an understatement, isn't it?
It certainly is an understatement. Coming third is bad news. It's bad news in two regards. In a UK context, they don't want the Tories to come back. They don't want the Tories to come back in Scotland. In a Scottish context, I suspect they'll be more worried about the rise of the SNP, who it looks as though they will do well, not well enough to win, but they'll be breathing down Labour's neck throughout Scotland when Scotland votes again for its parliamentary elections. Henry McLean referred to those difficult circumstances. What we've seen here is Labour unpopular in the Scottish Parliament, unpopular in Westminster, and unpopular in Ayr itself, where the local council has taken unpopular decisions. So it has been a difficult set of circumstances. The key will be, what lessons does Labour think it has to learn? Henry McLean said they would have to learn. He didn't say what the lessons would be, and there'll be a damn great fight in Scotland and UK-wide about what those lessons should be.
Professor McLean, they were supposed to have learned lessons after Hamilton South, where traditional voters then deserted them. They don't appear to have done.
Well, it may be very difficult to know what lesson they can learn. Governments always do badly in mid-term. This is mid-term for the Labour and Liberal Democrat coalition in Scotland. The SNP always picks up votes from them. And now, with the Scottish Parliament, the SNP, the Scottish Nationalists, are picking up even more.
Well, I have to interrupt you there, because we are just seconds away from that result. Let's take you to the live pictures there. Andrew Cassell, our correspondent, is still watching proceedings with me. Andrew.
Matthew, thank you. You'll just about join us now for the declaration.
Here's the result for the Ayr constituency by-election. William Clifton Botcherby, Scottish Independent, the Radio Vet, 186 votes. Gavin Nelson Corbett, the Scottish Green Party, 460 votes. Kevin James Dillon, Independent anti-cloning candidate, 15 votes. Robert Graham, Pro-Life Alliance, 111 votes. Jim Mather, Scottish National Party, SNP, 9,236 votes. Alistair David McConaughey, UK Independence Party, 113 votes. Rita Miller, Scottish Labour Party, 7,054 votes. Stuart David Ritchie, Scottish Liberal Democrats, 800 votes. John Scott, the Scottish Conservative and Unionist candidate, 12,000. James Stewart, Scottish Socialist Party convener Tommy Sheridan, 1,300. accepted votes. I declare John Scott to be elected to represent the constituency of Ayr in the Scottish Parliament.
So there we have it, victory for the Conservatives. A majority of 3,344. A good night for the Scottish Conservatives as he takes the handshakes from his opponents. A poor night for Labour. They've been beaten into third place by the SNP. And John Scott, the victorious candidate, seems about to give his speech now.
Returning officer, ladies and gentlemen, it is indeed an honour to have been selected and elected as the MSP for the Ayr constituency. I am humbled to have been elected to follow the footsteps of previous great Conservative representatives who have done so much for the people of Ayrshire. We have had a long election campaign which effectively started the day the previous MSP stood down. I'm sure that the electorate is quite relieved that that is all over now and that they won't continue to be embarrassed by leafleters and canvassing. I know too that they will be pleased to return the first constituency MSP for the Tory party and to have an elected MSP who will stand up for the issues that matter and fight to represent their concerns in Edinburgh.
I haven't got the percentages at all.
Tories more than 40%, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Well, there you have the result from Ayr. John Scott winning by a majority of 3,344, polling 12,580. The SNP second place, getting 9,236, and Labour pushed into third, as we were predicting, with just over 7,000 votes. Well, with me still is our chief political correspondent, Nick Robinson, and the Professor of Politics at Oxford University, Ian McLean. Professor, first, what do you make of it? A bigger majority than we were anticipating?
A bigger majority than we were anticipating, and I'm glad that in our previous segment, my hunch that the SNP was going to win didn't make it onto air, since it was wrong. The Conservatives have done well, better than predicted, still with less than 40% of the vote, but they've got reason to be pleased, as do the SNP. Labour, of course, are the ones licking their wounds.
Nick, Labour licking their wounds. Just how upset will the Labour Party there in Scotland and nationally be?
Oh, they're going to be very upset about this. Coming third is going to be really worrying. They're only on just over 22% of the vote. Compare that with the general election, 48-odd%. The Scottish Parliament elections in the same seat, 38%. This is a big drop in their vote. The SNP have done well, and the Tories have done better than people expected. They did and were expected to win the seat, but many people said they might win it but not increase their share of the vote. But they have. It's not by very much, as Ian McLean's just said, up from 38% in the Scottish parliamentary elections to 39.5%, but it's enough for them to say, not only have we got an election, but we haven't done it simply because Labour have collapsed. We are actually more popular than we were.
But is it enough for William Hague to be talking about rebuilding in Scotland, 3 years almost into a government, obvious protest vote? Is this enough to actually build on?
Well, it's a first step, and that'll do it, because there haven't been many steps at all. He's been static, so it'll do, and there's enough to cause problems for Labour. We know there's divisions in Labour north of the border. There's been concerns about Donald Duer's leadership. There have been debates about their tactics too. This will fuel that, undoubtedly.
Professor McLean, quick word about the Liberal Democrats. They've almost disappeared off the political radar.
Yes, they were beaten by the Scottish Socialist Party, that is the Tommy Sheridan party, that is a left-wing breakaway from the Labour Party. On the other hand, they've never done well in this particular constituency. And
will they be questioning their role in the government there, the coalition government? Will they be looking at these figures and thinking, have we made a mistake?
They've nowhere else to go. It's that or nothing, and this is their first experience of government since the days of Lloyd George. And I think a neutral person would say they haven't made too bad a job of being in government, but they were bound to be squeezed in a constituency like this.
OK, more from both of you a little later. Let's go straight back to the count in Ayr and our correspondent there, Andrew Cassell. Andrew, clearly delighted the Conservatives there.
Yes, I think they are. I think, as you said in the studio, they've done better than even they expected. They were predicting about a 2,000 majority, so 3,344 is not bad from their point of view. And I think they'll be highly delighted because, of course, this is their first constituency MSP in the Scottish Parliament. Up until now, they've had list MSPs thanks to the proportional representation system, so they'll be absolutely delighted. And with me gauging the reaction in the hall is Dean Nelson, who's the political editor of the Scotsman. Dean, they certainly have done better than most people predicted, haven't they, in terms of their majority, the Tories?
They have done better. They needed to do better than 38%, which is what they got at the Scottish general election. They appear to have done that, and I think that gives them enough for William Hague to try and claim this as the beginning of the Tory fight back. So they'll be very pleased. They'll be very pleased with it. Labour obviously disappointed, although I don't think they seriously expected much more. Donald Dewar effectively threw in the towel yesterday, and it's also an incredible advance for the Scottish National Party in an area that's not one of their traditional strongholds.
But what are Labour going to do with this now? I mean, you know, this is a disaster for them, isn't it?
Well, I think disaster's probably putting it a bit strong. There were local factors. There was the row over Section 28. I think they're going to, you know, go away, look at what lessons there are for them to learn, to lick their wounds, and then, you know, hopefully look forward to another election where Section 28 and the background noise that actually drowned out their campaign in large measure isn't there.
But it seems as though some of the protest votes from Labour have also gone to the Scottish Socialist Party as well, because they've knocked the Liberal Democrats back into 5th place, haven't they?
Absolutely. I mean, the Scottish Socialist Party is a phenomenon that won't be known to many people in England, but it does largely revolve around their charismatic leader, Tommy Sheridan, who is very, very popular in the Scottish Parliament. The party doesn't seem to have a much broader base than that, but it does pick up on Labour disaffection in its heartlands.
So it's been a pretty miserable night, but a pretty good night. Pretty miserable night for Labour, but a pretty good night for the SNP. I mean, they will think that all this effort they put in the by-election campaign has been worthwhile, won't they?
Absolutely. I mean, at the UK general election in '97, they were around 12%. They jumped up to 19 in the Scottish election, and now they're around the 30% mark. A lot of Labour MPs in Westminster constituencies are going to be very frightened at their performance this time.
And also, one of the difficulties they have, I suppose, for the SNP is that what is the broader message that this is going to send to the Scottish political scene? Because the SNP are now the opposition, we know that, in Scotland. But this is going to reinforce that message, isn't it?
Absolutely, it's going to be fear because you know, at Hamilton, the by-election, the Westminster by-election, about 6 months or so ago, the SNP made incredible advances in an area where they haven't performed well since Winnie Ewing won the seat in the late 60s. There is a general creeping up of nationalist support in Labour's traditional heartlands, and Labour MPs and MSPs are terrified about what that will mean at the next Scottish election.
Dean Nelson, for the moment, thank you very much indeed. So, back in the air, some of the speeches, as you can see behind me, are still going on, but for the moment it's back to you in the studio in London. Matthew.
Andrew, thanks very much indeed. Well, it's been a busy old last 15 or so minutes. Let me just recap for you. The Conservative Party is celebrating this morning after a convincing win in the first by-election of the Scottish Parliament. The Tories took air with a majority of more than 3,000, polling 12,580 votes. There you see it. It's the first directly elected seat the party has won in Scotland. Labour, who went into the by-election with a majority of just 25, was pushed into 3rd place with just over 7,000 votes. The Scottish National Party came in 2nd with more than 9,000 votes. The Liberal Democrats polled just 800 votes, coming 5th behind the Scottish Socialist Party. Just a quick final word from our two guests. Nick Robinson first. How will the various political parties view these figures, do you think?
Well, there's a question of how they'll view them and how they'll present them in public. In public, William Hague will say we're on the way back. He'll say we're on the way back. UK-wide and in Scotland, in their private moments, they'll know that there's not been a huge increase in the Tory vote. What they've done is gained from the unpopularity of the Labour Party with a little bit of help from the SNP. Labour will be worried. There's no doubt about that. They'll be worried by the rise of the SNP. They'll be worried by the collapse of their own vote. Losing the seat, not such a problem. It's the size of the dent in their vote and support that will concern them, and the fact that this result could be used by enemies of Tony Blair and enemies of Donald Dewar in Scotland to say they're getting it wrong and things must change.
Professor McLean, national trends and what is going wrong in Scotland for Labour?
Well, it's very difficult to predict a UK national trend from a Scottish by-election. In fact, we shouldn't do it at all, because the Conservatives gained in Ayr, as Nick has just said, with a lot of help from the Scottish Nationalists. The Scottish Nationalist vote went up by 10 percentage points, the Conservatives only by 1. And Labour voters in Scotland didn't defect in any numbers, according to the polls that we've seen, to the Conservatives, but they did to the Scottish Nationalists, who have no equivalent in England. So I wouldn't like to look in a crystal ball on that.
OK, Professor McLean, Nick Robinson, thank you both very much indeed. Well, that is it. It has been an interesting last hour and a half or so. Scotland, the Conservatives coming back in Scotland, their first victory in a by-election in Scotland since 1967, coming out with a majority of over 3,000. More coverage on that throughout the course of the evening here on BBC News 24.